Good evening, everyone. My name is Edith Blumhofer, and for the last 15 years, I have been director of the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, and I'm delighted that all of you could join us this evening for one last evening with the ISAE. As we were thinking about the program tonight, I thought about the many times over the past 30-plus years that we have met in this room for evening events and many topics like missions, politics, hymnody, Billy Graham, Pentecostalism, voluntary associations, the Bible, North Atlantic Protestantism, on and on. And we've had some good times right here. Earlier this year, the administration at Wheaton College decided to close the ISAE at the end of this calendar year. And Wheaton College has been generous in its support. It has made a contribution to the event that we're celebrating this evening, for which I would like to be sure to thank them. But there will only be one more edition of the Evangelical Studies Bulletin, and then the Institute's work will become part of the college archives. Those of us who work at the Institute and have attended the conferences frequently use the archives, and I will tell you it's a strange feeling to think that you will be a collection number in the archives come January 1st. Tonight we look forward to a program that's designed to feature some of the people who founded and shaped the ISAE over the years. Our conversation about studying evangelicalism and thinking about the topics that the ISAE has focused on for so long will continue tomorrow at Harbor House beginning at 9 in the morning. And if you would like to know more about tomorrow's schedule and think about dropping in sometime, well, please see me or Larry Eskridge later. Now I'm going to invite you as we begin to welcome Joel Carpenter, who was the first director of the ISAE, who's going to lead us in prayer as we begin this evening, and then I'll announce the rest of the program. Joel.
Good evening, one and all. Let us come before the Lord. Oh God, we thank you for this institute. We thank you for this period of time when we've been blessed with the opportunities to convene and to encourage and to organize and to promote and communicate new understandings of what it's meant to be a born-again Christian in North America and increasingly other parts of the world. Lord, we are grateful for the institutional base here at Wheaton College. Lord, we're grateful for a number of strategic funders of the work here, and so many people who've supported the efforts here through their participation. Oh Lord, our hearts are full tonight because of so much that's been able to happen by your grace. And Lord, we pray that you would bless our conversations today and tomorrow, and that you will be glorified by what transpires here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
We're going to begin our program by devoting 7 or 8 minutes to something that was not on the poster that announced the event, and it's a reminiscence, a farewell video done by our good friend Tim Frakes, a videographer who is located in Glen Ellen and with whom we've worked on other projects that you can actually purchase at the bookstore later. This may show you a side of the ISAE that you haven't seen or thought about. Some of this happens outside of Barrows, believe it or not.
American evangelicalism is a sprawling, diverse movement with roots on this continent that go back nearly 300 years. The movement can be traced back to the early Pietists, through the First and Second Great Awakenings, the hegemony of early and mid-19th century American Protestantism, the beginnings of Pentecostalism, the development of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, the coming together of a self-consciously evangelical movement post-World War II, the spread of an armada of evangelical relief and parachurch organizations, and finally, the rise of megachurches and movements for social justice and political influence in the latter decades of the 20th century. How to make sense of and understand evangelicalism's growth in a way that explores and explains the movement to outsiders and insiders, academics and laypeople. That has been the task undertaken by Wheaton College's Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, the ISAE.
The Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals has existed to promote the study of evangelicalism in, first of all, America, but also by using comparative studies and networking with other institutes elsewhere. We've begun to pay more attention to some of the things that are happening in other parts of the world. And we have been able, through the generosity of various funders, to provide funding for junior scholars as well as senior scholars. We have been able to participate in the unfolding of the blossoming study of the role of evangelicalism in the history of Christianity, and more particularly and directly in the history of the United States.
The origins of the Institute trace back to the late 1970s, when a group of religious historians gathered at a small conference on evangelical perspectives of the American Revolution at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois.
The prehistory goes back to Trinity College in Deerfield. In the spring of 1977, the dean at Trinity College in Deerfield, Ed Hakes, made available, I think it was $600, that brought Nathan Hatch from Notre Dame to Deerfield. George Marsden was teaching at the seminary that year. I was at Trinity College, and we had enough money to fly out Harry Stout from Connecticut. We did a little conference on Christianity in the American Revolution, so a timely topic in 1977. The next year we did a conference that was similar. Sitting around after that meeting at a local eatery, someone said, well, it'd be good, given evangelical Christians' interest in the Bible as a doctrine, if we historians thought about evangelical attitudes toward the Bible, or just more general attitudes to the Bible, as a historical project.
Out of that meeting, two Wheaton alums from the class of 1968, Dr. Mark Noll of Wheaton's History Department and Dr. Nathan Hatch of the History Department at the University of Notre Dame, formulated an idea for a conference on the role of Scripture in American history. Attracting the interest of Dr. Robert Lynn at the Lilly Endowment, funds were provided for a conference at Wheaton on the Bible in America in November of 1979. The papers from the conference were put together in a volume of the same name published by Oxford University Press. Response from the conference and the volume were so positive that, with a grant from Lilly and sponsorship from Wheaton College, an Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals was established at Wheaton in 1982, when Joel Carpenter was brought aboard to be the ISAE's first director to help oversee a 1983 conference on evangelical Christianity and modern America, and a new grant was soon awarded that set out projects and conferences dealing with topics such as Jonathan Edwards, Christian theology, the development of Christian higher education, and the American missionary movement. In the next few years, the ISAE began its own newsletter, the Evangelical Studies Bulletin. In 1987, the ISAE brought evangelical scholars such as Dr. Carl F. H. Henry, J.I. Packer, and Alvin Plantinga to campus for a conference entitled A New Agenda for Evangelical Thought. The Pew Charitable Trusts awarded the ISAE a grant for a series of dialogues between American evangelicals and representatives of other American faith traditions, as well as a project to study evangelicals' role in American politics and the relationship between evangelicals and mass media. In 1989, Darrell Hart, a recent PhD from the Johns Hopkins University, became the ISAE's new director. With the assistance of Edith Blumhofer and new ISAE staffer Larry Eskridge, Hart led the Institute during an important period.
Well, I think in a lot of ways America had discovered the evangelical movement for a variety of reasons. The expanding impact of cultural movements, visibility of the televangelists, an increase in political involvement that made the wider public begin to wonder who these people were. On the academic side, The interest in evangelicals in terms of scholarship had really moved into a new phase.
Over the years, there's been a lot of networking through summer gatherings. They were very regular at first, and spouses and families were welcome. So I think that the ISAE found ways to encourage not only informal communication over what you're interested in now, what you're doing now, entirely aside from conferences and more formal connections and programs, but also to bring families and spouses into the network and create a really tight group of friendships.
In 1999, Edith Blumhofer became the director of the ISAE. During this time, the ISAE extended its outreach to the public with an expanded website and its first forays into video, including People of Faith, a 6-part documentary targeting adult Sunday school classes in small groups. In 2013, the ISAE held its final public conference, The Worlds of Billy Graham, examining the career and ministry of Wheaton's favorite son, evangelist Billy Graham.
The meetings that the Institute sponsored and the people from other areas of study who also had an interest in Christianity, whose interests intersected with the study of evangelicalism in some way or another, who came to Wheaton, I think were brought to a conversation that succeeded to a large extent in convincing them that the study of evangelicalism would enrich the larger study of Christianity's role in American history.
Through its publications and the work of hundreds of scholars funded and given direction by its numerous projects, Wheaton College's Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, over its 30-plus year history, has contributed a lasting body of work that will help future generations better understand the nature and extent of evangelical Christianity's role in the American, and by extension global, story of Christianity.
So we've had lots of fun along the way, as well as lots of opportunity for serious work and friendship building, and we're grateful for that. And now I'd like to introduce Nathan Hatch, who is one of the founders of the ISAE. You can guess which one of the two he was on those photos. And he will moderate the panel discussion that will be the bulk of our program this evening.
Our panel discussion is going to be on the evangelical future, but I would like to take a few minutes to reflect on the past and the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals. So please allow me to have a few reflections. A true friendship, both Emerson and C.S. Lewis have argued, often springs from common interests and passions, from shared purpose. Lewis has suggested that friendship often begins with the stark realization of shared insight. What? You too? I thought I was the only one. The ISAE grew out of a set of relationships from young historians, all interested in American religious history, and in particular their own histories, and in exploring what it meant to be Christian scholars. And this community was a powerful and life-giving, a rare gift. In some ways, the ISAE was premised on friendship. It's not as if it's a set of young historians, people like George Marsden, Mark Noll, Harry Stout, Grant Wacker, Joel Carpenter, and George Rollick, later Edith, Randy Ballmer, Mike Hamilton, Richard Hughes, Jim Bratt, came together. It wasn't that we were formed in any of the same cultures, but somehow we ended up being interested in many of the same things, and we formed bonds of friendship that was a rare privilege. And for a number of summers, we and our families would gather and critique each other's work and enjoy fellowship, and that was a remarkable gift And so in some ways, it's that pattern of friendship that stands behind the formal work of the ISAE. Those circles continued to expand. They became more international. The inclusion of George Rollick, Canadian, who became sort of indispensable member of the crew, people like David Bebbington, Marge Hutchinson, and others. It continued to expand as a number of people like Marsden and Stout and Grant Wacker and Mark Noll had graduate students. And in a sense, that network continued to expand. But in a sense, it was based on friendship and common interests. Let me just say something about the common interests that I think this group shared. First of all of us came from, broadly speaking, an evangelical heritage and had a keen interest in exploring this history. Somehow we all believed firmly also that we should become really good historians, that we wanted tough, no-nonsense history, no parochialism. We wanted to be fully a part of the guild. And as Timothy Smith said, let the chips fall where they may. And so from the beginning, we had a sort of feet in both worlds. That was a blessing. It also made it difficult. And sometimes the cultural dissonance was great. I can remember at the conference on Jonathan Edwards here in the Billy Graham Center, having Norman Firing and Bill Hutchinson, one secular, one very liberal Harvard professor, take a walk through the gospel here at the Billy Graham Center. The cultural dissonance with that was as sharp as I've ever experienced. But there was that dimension, trying to be as good a historians as we could, but also explore this tradition. We also did have a point of view, I guess, or a point of view. Somehow all felt our traditions were missing the mark in some important ways. The first conference was on the Bible and American culture at a time when there was a lot of debate about inerrancy and theologically what should we think about the Bible. Somehow we thought it was equally instructive to say, how have people who claimed the Bible alone, how they actually used it, and what implications does that have for us? Or Mark and George and I put together a book drawn from some other work we had done, The Search for Christian America. The goal of which to say, it's a very complicated question to say, was America Christian or not? And there were a lot of simplistic answers in the market. So how do you look at that in more nuanced kinds of ways? So somehow this group of evangelical historians, from time to time we would be criticized from inside the tradition as being too open, giving away too much, not being doctrinal enough, being functionalists. And on the other side, we were criticized sometimes by others that we were too confessional and sort of too committed to a tradition, and how could you do objective scholarship? But this was it was a rare privilege to have come along at a time when friends with common interests could take up these challenges, and I'm deeply grateful for that. I'm deeply grateful to my friends who were part of that. I'm deeply grateful to Wheaton College and the Billy Graham Center for letting us practice our craft here. And I'm deeply grateful to Mark Noll, Joel Carpenter, Darrell and Edith, who were directors of this institute, and to Larry Eskridge, whose understanding of modern evangelical history I think is second to none, who has been the mainstay in supporting so many important projects. The Pew Charitable Trust was mentioned. They were an early funder, and over the years, probably the biggest funder has been the Lilly Endowment. we're deeply grateful to Bob Lynn and Craig Dykstra, who over the years were real patrons of what we were doing. So now let me ask my colleagues to come for the panel, I think. And we will not just look at the past, but see where they think the evangelical movement is going today. Topic for tonight is a movement for the 21st century, the future of evangelicalism. And I'm delighted to welcome Mark Hutchinson, who is Dean of Humanities and Academic Project at the Scots College in Sydney, Australia, and Director of the Center for the Study of Australian Christianity. Mark Noll is the Francis McInerney Professor of American History at the University of Notre Dame and taught here at Wheaton from 1978 until 2006. Grant Wacker joined the faculty of Duke Divinity School in 1992 after 15 years working for that other color of blue in Chapel Hill, and is the author of the just published book by Harvard University Press, America's Pastor, Billy Graham, and the Shaping of a Nation. And David Bebbington is this year is the visiting professor at Baylor University and is a distinguished historian of evangelicalism and particularly of British evangelicalism. So, Grant, let's...
Well, all right. Since I was called on first. About 20 years ago, when my younger daughter was about 10, she was sitting at the breakfast table, and I came downstairs with a little suitcase, and she said, "Are you going on a trip?" And I realized I hadn't told her, and I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Where are you going?" And so I told her I was off to give a talk at that occasion at Pepperdine University. And she said, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Well, I think I'll talk about the Christian right." And she pondered that, and she said, "How long are you going to talk?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes. Long pause, and then she said, "Papa, do you know that much?" Well, when you're in a crowd like this, that question arises because it's pretty intimidating to look out over this audience. The room is filled with people who are dear friends and people who know an enormous amount about this subject, and it is a sobering moment, and it's also a great honor. I want to talk just very briefly about what seemed to me to be new directions and promising directions in the study of evangelicalism. We are coming to the end of the long tenure of the ISAE, and there's a generational change, both in the people who write it and in the horizons of things that interest the new historians. And I just want to suggest about 7 different areas, and I hope we can talk about it later, but areas that seem to me especially promising and exciting. It's not to say that it hasn't been done until now, but it's to say that these are frontiers that I see as especially rich. And the first of these has to do with expansionism, which is another way of thinking about missions, but with more attention to the idea of how evangelicals and evangelicalism has penetrated larger expansionist impulses in American history. And that takes its form in social gospel, the kind of thing that Heather Curtis is now writing about called holy humanitarianism. It's taken form in American imperialism, involvement in American government, as well as multiple ways that we see benevolences being extended into the rest of the world. And it also shows up in the way that evangelicals have thought about world religions and cultural exchange and interchange. So all kinds of issues involved in expansionism, and this strikes me as very exciting. A second area that's very exciting is the attention to capitalism and the role of capitalism and the origins of evangelicalism and where it's going. It has a lot to say about how evangelicalism is rooted in an economy of affluence, individuals who enjoy a measure of affluence so that they can carry out their mission, that expansionist mission. It says a lot about the rationalist, liberal sense of autonomy that defines both capitalism and evangelicalism. A lot about networking among moguls, as we've seen with Darren Jochuk's work, moguls involved in extractive industry or in high finance. In multiple ways, we find that capitalism offers new venues. A third area that I find exciting is that of biography. And lots of new works focused on biography. And what's significant about that, it strikes me, is not only the continuation and resurgence of the power of narrative, but also the sense that agency is not eclipsed or defined by social conditioning, nor is it defined by, as postmodernists would have it, by the constraints imposed by language and culture, but rather agency is real. There's really something out there, and new work is paying attention to it. A fourth area that I see is very exciting is the attention to material culture within evangelicalism. That is, how evangelicals have expressed material culture. A new sense of sacramentalism, that is, looking at material culture as the embodiment of vehicles of meaning and the sacred, rituals, ritualism, the sense that bodies, physical bodies, really do matter and how they encounter and express the divine. In architecture, in food practices, in so many ways, we see the study of material culture coming into our understanding of evangelicals. A fifth area is the continuation of the older interest in race, class, gender, now supplemented with new attention to region. And not simply region in the sense that, well, evangelicals are more common in the South, although that's very important, but a particular attention to the power and significance of local place and how places bear upon the development of a spiritual integrity and a whole register of spiritual concerns. The sixth one, we're coming near the end, the sixth one is an insurgence of interest in ideas. Ideas understood both as old-fashioned intellectual biography, intellectual studies of ideas and how ideas interact with one another and spark new ideas. I think, for example, of Molly Worthen's very exciting new book about controversies about biblical authorities, and that whole book is executed at a very high level of intellectual history, but also other ways of thinking about the role of ideas that might be better thought of as consciousness, the way people see the world around them, and how that kind of cognition influences their religious faith. And lastly, there are many, many more, but the seventh and what I see exciting area is the very strong new interest in the relation of evangelicals with reference to the mainline or the mainline or Protestant mainline. And here the focus falls not only upon how the main line helped define who evangelicals were, but also the reciprocal influence of how evangelicalism has helped create the main line itself. And this kind of attention to that interface shows a great deal of energy. So those are some of the directions. I would make one final comment about the social organization of the Guild and the new generation in itself. It strikes me that many of the older practitioners, myself included, were very often insiders. Not all practitioners, but many of them were. And more than that, were self-revelatory, self-revealing. They acknowledged where they were right in the outset of their books and say, social location matters. It strikes me that more often in the younger generation and the new works, we see more of a reticence about acknowledging one's position. And I think there are different reasons, there's different sociology in the Guild that brings about this reticence to be about establishing one's perspective. Very interesting reasons that brought the self-revelation into existence, I think, a generation ago, and also interesting, and I hope we can talk about reasons why we don't see that very often. A final characteristic I see in the new generation of work is that it is extremely analytical and finely parsed and delicately executed, and it's a very impressive body of scholarship. Tomorrow we'll have a session in which we'll talk about the new directions of younger historians, but in all of the cases, it's just exciting. I'll close by saying that the story is commonly told about Perry Miller when he undertook to write a doctoral dissertation at the University of Chicago in the 1930s, and he told his advisor that he wanted to write about Puritans, and he was told, don't do that, because we've already said everything there is to say about Puritans. Well, Miller found something else to say about Puritans and revolutionized the generation of historians working at that subject, and I see that happening. There are lots of new frontiers, and it's very exciting.
Thank you, Grant. Mark?
I'm not sure it's a good idea ever to ask historians to talk about the future. So I have tried to consider how thinking about the past might provide some clues for the future. And so I begin tonight with evangelical historical scholarship. We're here tonight because of existing scholarship in the very near past. Almost every book of solid evangelical history, and of the sort that Grant has been mentioning, that has really been a phenomenon of recent years, has passed through doorways cracked open by a very few significant works in the not too distant past. I'm going to single out three of these. First, Timothy L. Smith's Revivalism and Social Reform, published in the mid-1950s, about the presence of evangelicals in the middle decades of the 19th century. Then George Marsden's Fundamentalism and American Culture, published in 1980, about mostly northern late 19th century evangelicals becoming early 20th century fundamentalists. And then David Bebbington's Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, published in 1989, tracking the course of evangelicals in Britain from the early 18th century to the late 20th century. Now, why were these books important? Why have dozens, maybe even perhaps hundreds, of books following in their train become so important? I originally was going to list some of those books, but first the list got too long, and then knowing some of the people who are going to be here tonight, I was afraid of leaving out really important ones. Well, there's 3 points that need to be made. These 3 books, and then many that have followed in their train, offered well-researched, compelling accounts of Christian movements in particular cultural situations. So Timothy Smith's Revivalism and Social Reform was not only about evangelical groups, but it was about the way in which evangelical groups shaped important trends in American popular culture in the mid-19th century. George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture was important not just because it did good research on fundamentalists, but even broader, better research on the shape of American culture as it was being shaken loose from what had been the instinctive Christian default positions of 100 years and more. And David Bebbington's book on evangelicalism in Britain worked out a very well-conceived pattern as to how evangelical instincts interacted with first Enlightenment ideas and practices, and then ideas and practices of the Romantic era. So why are these books important? Because they were well-researched and compelling accounts of Christian movements in local situations. Well, what was the payoff then, secondly, from these well-researched, compellingly written historical accounts? Among other results, I think I need to stress that, among other results, they made it possible to see more clearly how the integrity of the gospel was maintained in interaction with a particular cultural setting and where that integrity was compromised. So with Smith, we have a very strong statement of the culture-shaping effects of active evangelical religion, but also, although this was actually not a theme that he liked to concentrate upon, some of the rest of us saw, a neglect of the life of the mind and the long-term demerits and bad consequences of that neglect. George's book on fundamentalism showed how important it was for all Christian movements to be resolute defenders of the supernatural as a critical element in simply being Christian, but also showed very clearly how the particular fundamentalist defense of the supernatural, beyond the important matter of preserving the supernatural, also trivialized the scriptures and greatly reduced the arenas of contemporary life that the scriptures were thought to talk about. And then David's book on evangelicalism in modern Britain showed how important it was for evangelicals at different stages in British history to learn from and to be able to express themselves in the language of Enlightenment modernity, romantic sensibility, and toward the end of the book, some post-romantic modern sensibilities, in a way that kept evangelicals alive as forces in British society, English society particularly, but then also at different points how it was easy for the Christian expressions to be too much dominated by what they had learned to speak, by the conceptions that they were bringing to bear in their own religious life. So that's the second point. The payoff is to be able to look back and see what is preserved in the integrity of Christian faith, what undermines that integrity. And then for the future, we would have to say that wherever evangelical types of Christianity are planted, the assessment is going to hinge upon these branches of the Christian faith engaging local cultures in such a way as to be able to communicate the gospel, or otherwise they're of no interest and completely irrelevant. But at the same time, wherever, whether it's urban China, whether it's urban Nigeria, whether it's rural Samoa, whether it is the Argentine Pampas, if the cultural integration is too extensive, if the Christian message is exhausted by the cultural instincts of a particular time and place, it will be salt having lost its savor. Evangelicalism in the 18th, 19th century was a mostly British, European, North American phenomenon. It's now become a worldwide phenomenon. The future of evangelical strands around the world will be determined by how well they walk the tightrope that has been defined by the really significant historical scholarship on evangelicals of the last generation.
Thank you, Mark. David.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let me express my gratitude to the Institute for the invitation today and for the invitation on many occasions in the past when I've enjoyed much good fun, food and fellowship, the 3 Fs. But may I suggest that the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals suffers from 2 misnomers. Firstly, it's called the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals. It's not. It has very frequently looked at evangelicals elsewhere, and that is one of its greatest merits. It's been international. And I think back to 1992, when we had the marvellous Transatlantic Evangelicalism Conference, which produced 2 books, but even more importantly produced many global contacts, most of which still survive and are fruitful. I do think that that is now commemorated very valuably in print, in Mark Noll's book From Every Tribe and Nation, out this month, which discusses his discovery of global evangelicalism. Well, a lot of that was through this institute. So I'm grateful to the ISAE, but it's got a wrong title. It's not just about America. Secondly, the misnomer applies to the final word in the title, too. It's called the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, and I suspect that there is a touch of skepticism that underlies the choice of that word. I think it's deliberate not to have used the word evangelicalism. I think that there are doubts here about whether evangelicalism has really existed. Mark, on my left, as many here will know, is a nominalist who criticises the notion of evangelicalism as invalid. It's no more than a name. And we had a discussion about this on a platform at Pepperdine University only last month, which I at least very much enjoyed. Now, I am absolutely convinced that something exists which can be called evangelicalism. It is characterized by emphases on Bible, cross, conversion, and activism. And where you find that, you find something called evangelicalism. Now, this institute does itself a disservice by simply saying it studies evangelicals. It has indeed repeatedly discussed evangelicalism in depth as a movement, not just individuals. So that's my second point. My third point, however, turns to a comparison between my own specialism, Britain, and America, which I have to admit has been the chief focus of the scholarship undertaken by this institution. How far has evangelicalism in its trajectory been the same thing in Britain and America? Well, I think in the 18th century, it's become pretty clearly established that it's the identical thing. The Great Awakening in America was the same thing as the evangelical revival in Britain. In the 19th century, I think evangelicalism remained very similar on the 2 sides of the Atlantic. In 1828, an American Presbyterian preacher in Manchester, England, in a congregational pulpit was said by the local pastor to have preached the same gospel which they were accustomed to hear. Common ground still in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, I think there was much more divergence. I think British evangelicalism became much more elite-dominated. Through intervarsity in particular, it came to be dominated by the Church of England to an unprecedented extent, by upper middle class attitudes, and therefore with English decorum and restraint. These were less relevant and less expressed on this side of the Atlantic. In America, by contrast, the holiness Pentecostal sector was much larger than in Britain, with all its popular enthusiasm. The fundamentalist sector was much larger, with its firm convictions and spirit of independence. And thirdly, the media were much stronger in the evangelical world. By 1984, the national religious broadcasters had 922 radio stations and 65 television stations affiliated. There was no equivalent in Britain at all. As a result, American evangelicalism had much more popular appeal, and hence numbers in America were hugely larger than in Britain. In 1984, 22% of the American population were called evangelicals by pretty reasonable criteria. At the same time, 2.8% of the British population were evangelicals. Total disparity. And that, I think, is because American evangelicalism has become a major force in American society during the 20th century in a way that Britain had not. Hence, fourthly, what of the 21st century? I think that cultural penetration as a result of the processes I've just discussed has been much greater by evangelicalism in America than in Britain. I take a concrete instance. I'm at present teaching at Baylor University in Texas, and I occasionally go to the local supermarket. I there find a breakfast food whose title is Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 9. And underneath that title, there is the following sentence. This biblical cereal is truly the staff of life. You would not find that in Britain. Popular penetration of the culture by the gospel is much greater in America, especially in Texas. What possibly American evangelicalism lacks in some measure, and only at certain times in certain places, perhaps overall, nevertheless, on balance, this is true, is cultural engagement at a higher level than breakfast cereals. Mark Noll has brought this out very vividly in his Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and what I'd want to suggest is that the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals has addressed that problem. It has suggested that evangelicalism is about more than cereals. It has suggested that the life of the mind must be brought into subjection of Christ in relation to a particular discipline, the discipline of history. I would like to think that the legacy of the Institute is that that dimension of evangelicalism will continue to be explored in America during the rest of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Mark. Don't you love the way that David encapsulates British restraint and then redefines the internal contents thereof? I thought when I was coming I'd be representing the rest of the world, which is a bit strange, being a white guy from Australia to represent the rest of the world, considering that we're somewhere between Britain and North America in terms of our evangelical content. I want to talk about past foundations, present potentials and future nows. In 1842, the first Presbyterian minister to establish himself in Australia, John Dunmore Lang, came to America on a tour on the way back, instead of going the other way via Egypt and Sri Lanka. He came via America, and he, for some reason, the rumour got around that he had a letter from Queen Victoria for the American president, so he got invited to the White House. He had no such thing, and not only that, he was actually in conflict with the British Crown at that point in time because he was insisting that Presbyterians were not dissenters. They were, in fact, the established Church of Scotland, and they'd won that right at the point of the swords of their forefathers, and therefore he promptly found himself excommunicated from Government House in New South Wales. But here he was wandering into the White House under total false pretences, and of course, like all Australians, he bluffed his way through. And that makes me feel a little bit like I am tonight. But anyway, past foundations. I think David's pointed it out that the differences between evangelical movements around the world are really important in order to isolate the similarities. In Australia and the UK, there is no movement for the restoration of a Christian country, because while, in a sense, the Anglican Church might think there was once a Christian country, evangelicals have always felt themselves to be a minority. And so it's the ability to gloss and to mobilise mass bases in non-evangelical constituencies, which in a sense have made evangelicals so powerful, both in the United Kingdom and in Australia. So it's the minority nature of evangelicalism in those places. And so understanding the histories, and asking the question, which evangelicalism, and what it will help you determine what future and in what place. Grant pointed out the importance of place for understanding how to answer that question about the future of evangelicalism. So these histories present different futures and current challenges. I mean, the challenge of being a majority, for example, in Zambia, as opposed to being a substantial bloc in the United States, South Korea, South Africa, as opposed to being a visible minority in Australia, we're 7.5% or probably a bit less than that, as opposed to being an invisible minority in Italy, but one which in fact has been there since before the Reformation. However substantial that invisible minority might be. And so the issues for each of those churches actually varies. And so which evangelicalism are we talking about when we talk about futures? The second thing in terms of past foundations is the market, in a sense, for recutting the cloth of the evangelical past to suit a current need, which, in a sense, when I think the ISAE started, there wasn't that much scholarly discussion about evangelicalism. Now there's a great deal of scholarly discussion about evangelicalism. But which evangelicalism and what sort of past is being retrieved in order to serve a current need? For example, in Australia, there's this ongoing debate about secular schooling because the government funds secular schooling. And so the question comes down to what did secular mean in 1880 when the Public Education Act was passed in New South Wales? Well, the current secularisers and also the Erastian efficiency people have gone back and, in a sense, tried to resurrect a past where, in a sense, the Christian and dissenting understanding of what secular meant in the 19th century is no longer in the past. They've, in a sense, attempted to erase it and impose a much later interpretation of what secular means back onto the 19th century. And people like Marion Maddox, for example, have built careers based on public funding from the social inclusivity agenda of the previous Labor government in Australia. Well, lambasting evangelicals for their A-statist attitudes looks like a less positive career move now that there's a Conservative government in power. And so the telling of the story has shifted subtly. That it depends on what period and which scholars you're looking at, that will, in a sense, determine the output of the literature. And the chattering classes, as the academics are called in Australia, we're highly prized by our very pragmatic culture, are not the only people to interest themselves in reclaiming a usable evangelical past. The ability to play football is actually rather more highly prized. For evangelicals, for example, the tendency has been in Australia, because of the diminished size of the public square, to let themselves be defined by the particular debate that's going on, which gives them traction in that square. And so, for example, at the moment, the Australian Christian lobby is busily fighting about abortion. And so in the Australian mindset, there is this sense that anti-abortionism is evangelicalism. And there's no sense of, in a sense, what its historic content is. And so, hence the importance of the sort of work which has been done at ISAE, and which the ISAE enabled people like myself and others in Australia to leverage off in order to insert that sort of discussion in Australia. In the 19th century, we might think that those sorts of debates were about social legislation. Well, the danger is that if you define yourself against the current issues, because our diversity leaves those as the default common concerns of evangelicals in the public square, then in other areas the old evangelical alliances start to look a little shaky. American evangelicals are currently in a tortured internal debate about race. I don't mean the academic ones. I mean, there's, in a sense, that debate has been had. But in the institutions themselves, everywhere I turn up to a conference, there is this sort of extreme politeness about the issue of race. And for those coming from other parts of the world, it's sort of odd that this should dominate debates which are often about global evangelicalism, because our histories have not placed those issues on the front foot in the same way. As in the global north, if we say, for instance, the Americans look abroad, they see South Africa, and in a sense they see their own history confirmed and say, look, in the rest of the world, the history out there is the same as it is for us because they've got those issues, we've got those issues. The British, on the other hand, look at those same realities and they see a history which dictates the need to talk about imperialism rather than race. Australians look at that experience in Africa and various other places and say, why is everyone talking about Africa and China and India? What about Oceania, where 98% of the population is Christian? Pound for pound, or is it just all about the numbers? Or is it the fact that evangelical scholars, in a sense, have been captured by a 19th century missionary mindset, and you're still trying to answer the questions which were being asked by the missionary agencies back as far back as 1792? Where did Oceania or Southeast Asia go while we were talking about Africa, India and China? So the future of evangelical scholarship can't simply be about the numbers. It needs to be about the quality of the locality and of the diversity of those historiographies. Secondly, present potentials. Evangelical presence really depends upon a number of things. Firstly, the state of the argument, the place of democratic discussion, what type of evangelical we're talking about and how they engage with culture, and what type of evangelical organisations within which they live. So what is the state of the argument? You know, the rise of technocracy in most of the West has meant voiding the public sphere of anything but debates about individual rights. Now, evangelicals have historically wanted to talk about more than that. They've wanted to talk about that, but they've also wanted to talk about classes of people and of, in a sense, the state of life of people. And so David talks about activism. And there's a tendency, I think, if you don't have the sort of institution like the ISAE, that you can forget to look at the state of the debate and in fact, have your own internal debates inside evangelical churches determined by your inability to reflect upon the past. The place of democratic discussion, I don't know about America. Well, I do know a little bit about America, but in Australia, as soon as you become involved in evangelical scholarship, you're very, very aware of the social controls on public discourse, about what can be said and what can't be said, and of the process of exclusion and of cutting out and of the deliberate sorts of processes which George Marsden, of course, has talked about in terms of the soul of the American university. That's very, very prominent in Australia and places where evangelicals are a minority. And what type of evangelical are we talking about? Are we talking about cultural Procrusteans versus the fish in the sea versus the Church of the Martyrs type evangelicals? There are different types of cultural approach by different evangelicals. Pentecostals versus charismatics versus the mainline. And there's all of the politics of that. And what type of evangelical organisation? The idea. I mean, the ISAE, I know, has had to work really hard to be present even in a Christian institution. Well, in Australia, of course, there are no Christian institutions. And in many, many countries, you just don't have the option of doing something like this. You've got to twist it in a different way. And many people in the rest of the world are having to do exactly that sort of thing. Are we talking, and what is the consequence of that for, in a sense, the rising dominant form of church around the world, which we might call the porous megachurch? That is, a church which never intends to serve all people or to keep all people who might come through its front door, but in fact many of whom end up going out the back door, and hence the Orange County Circle and the relationship between mainstream churches and evangelicals, which needs to be explored much more in depth. And so to future nows, there's a sense in which, in my opinion, evangelical futures and the future of evangelical scholarship will largely be worked out according to our responses to certain determinative dilemmas. Evangelical communities are largely stable in the West with spots of growth. Indeed, there's more growth in the West than is often allowed in the secular literature. For example, amongst the Rom in France and Spain. Often, however, that sort of thing is misunderstood or problematic, and so it's dismissed by the broader literature, or it's unknown. You don't know what you don't know. What is going to happen, for instance, in terms of both the scholarship about Russian evangelicalism and those churches themselves, which are now increasingly in the diaspora, when in fact, for many of those denominations, the majority of recent converts come from recovered drug addicts. Now, that is going to really bend the way an evangelical future works. And that's one evangelical future in the West, that the core cultures will either secularise or disappear into cantons, and evangelicalism is, as was in a sense the case of the Dalits in India after independence, the spiritual technology of the marginalisation and oppressed will effectively become evangelicalism. That's a really interesting future, and it's a possibility in the West. Evangelicals are also growing in the rest of the world, of course, and we often pin our hat upon that, but think about the consequences of that sort of dependence. Global migration flows indicate increased evangelical presence in the West, but it also increases intercommunal conflict. What effect will the exile of 1 million Middle Eastern Christians have abroad and at home in the Middle East? What will the impact on evangelical missions in the Middle East, which have for the last 100 years or so depended upon the presence of an indigenous Christian set of communities which could be evangelised without breaching Muslim anti-proselytism laws? Those are very significant questions for evangelicalism about how it pitches into what once were a sort of a sense of presence and continuity, and now they're pitching into places which are increasingly becoming vacuums. And that's a future where people who are, in a sense, evangelicals and define themselves as, say, Palestinian evangelicals, find, in fact, their majority populations based in New York or Sydney or Cape Town. And then you've got the problem of migrant acclimatisation without liberalisation. How does that happen? You know, that migration is not a neutral activity, that as people move and they shift class, then the evangelicalism they bring with them changes. Also, it changes with their language and their cultural appropriations. And the final thing that I think is pretty important is for evangelical futures is the problem of politicisation. It's already a really big issue in the Middle East, in India, China, Burma, Malaysia, and most other Muslim majority states. How do you progress without becoming co-involved in big state politics? How do you, in a sense, avoid being on the side of one big state player or another and continue to do the work of the gospel? It's very clear, for example, that BJP India gets a lot less attention than Communist Party-run China or Iran in terms of human rights because it's being feted as an important regional counterbalance for the West. There is a sense in which evangelicals in India don't get the same treatment as evangelicals elsewhere in the non-West when they're being seen by the West, and particularly Western evangelicals. So the effect for community-based suppression of evangelical activities is a source of constant tension, and that's a future too for evangelicals. And the same might be said for the impact of the current Pope on Catholic evangelical relationships in Latin America, which, as a scholar of Pentecostalism and with particular Italian interests, is something which I think we're going to see roll out over the next few years.
Thank you, Mark. Let me see if my colleagues have questions of each other or reactions to what has been said.
We're all waiting for the British response.
They're all in agreement. If not, then let me open the floor to questions. And I think there are, is it right that there are microphones or not? Yeah, there are 2 microphones, so if you go to those and identify yourself, please.
I'm Tim Larson from Wheaton College. So this whole second row here in the middle, except for Dr. McNutt, are all MA students in the history of Christianity. I wonder if you could advise them. Yeah, good. TJ waved to them. Don't tell them how horrible the academic job market is. They know that speech already. But advise them on possible topics that you'd like to see people who are heading towards theses and dissertations that you think are new areas that need to be explored. Maybe talk about where to go for doctorates, kind of the way forward for a generation that's currently at the MA level.
I'm currently employed by Baylor University, Texas. That is a declaration of interest. I do, however, think that Baylor University, Texas, which has in the past 5 years begun a doctoral program within the Department of History, specializing in the history of religion in America and Britain, would possibly meet the taste of many people sitting on the second row. It is, however, of course, highly competitive, and therefore no places could be guaranteed. However, I think under the tuition of Dr. Larson, you have a huge advantage.
This is a question I think comes back to Nathan's comments at the beginning. I actually am very reluctant to suggest topics ever, because the ideal researcher is going to be working on something that she or he is really interested in, really committed to, really worried about, and then is able to situate that personal interest against what other people are doing. And the latter point is very important, because it means that you're not just doing something therapeutic or something apologetic or something critical, but you are taking your interest and seeing what others might be able to do to help you expand your interest, and then eventually you'll be able to try to convince others that your historical account of what you're interested in should be important to them, even though they haven't realized it yet. And that's the Perry Miller success. And as Harry Stout said, I don't quite ever believe him yet, the ISAE can be the Perry Miller for evangelical. Evangelical is.
Yeah, let me follow up to that. I read Bernard Bailyn, the Harvard historian, made a statement one time: the best history is done when a new set of questions arises about which someone is passionate, and they find a set of documents, evidence to explore it. That's where breakthroughs come. And I think of the Yale historian David Bryan Davis, who spent much of his life studying race. And the reason for that was he was a young Army private who at the end of the Second World War was with our Army in Europe. And what he noted was the deep racism in the U.S. Army. And this puzzled him, and that's what he wanted to explain, and essentially spent his life exploring.
I would concur certainly with those comments, that I think that the best work is very often, not always, but very often done by individuals who are puzzled, troubled about an issue, but it also arises deep in their own experience. And it's a way to spend the rest of your life getting paid to figure yourself out, and it's a lot of fun sometimes. And Mark said it's not therapy because it's subjected to all kinds of critical tools. But I do think that the most exciting dissertations very often arise from these kinds of personal questions. And I want to stress that is not always the case. Sometimes these are just purely intellectual issues that people come to encounter. But it just strikes me that the study of evangelicals in particular is subject to this kind of strong autobiographical motivation, again, then subjected to the critical fires of graduate work and good graduate teachers.
Thank you. A couple of the speakers in the panel have stressed the importance of locality. I do think that it is a huge advantage to know a locality intimately if one's trying to write about it. And I think, therefore, one of the best bits of advice for anybody contemplating doing a social history as opposed to an intellectual history dissertation is to concentrate on the area where you were brought up. You know what it means to live on the other side of the railroad. You know what it means to be sent to the asylum. You know what the local idiom is all about. And that sensitivity can actually be an enormously enriching dimension of the study. Choose your own locality if you can.
Yes. I wonder if you could expand upon perhaps some of what you've touched on tonight. I recall Dr. Marsden writing about the demise of Christian civilization, and here we are at the demise, apparently, of the ISAE. And I read some tweets recently about Dr. Noll talking about evangelicalism as a movement, perhaps not existing, and I sense some debate there among the panel. And I'm wondering if you could expand upon that and address the question if do local manifestations of evangelical faith and practice cohere into something greater? Thank you.
I think one of the things which David had really given the craft is the ability, his idea of, well, you can't call it triangulation, but between the quadrilateral between the different elements, and it provides you with the ability to understand evangelicalism as a shifting thing. It's a shifting range of alliances which embodies itself. And Mark and I were talking earlier today about this sort of ceaseless search amongst scholars to find, in a sense, some sort of essence to evangelicalism which is the same everywhere. And therefore to find the person who brought it to, say, India, or who brought it to here or there, and therefore to establish genealogies. Whereas in many cases, there is this grassroots indigeneity about evangelicalism, and which then, in a sense, comes to recognise itself when it comes to, in a sense, to focus upon a particular issue. And somebody from India and somebody from the United States and someone from Britain or Australia or Malaysia or whatever will find themselves in a situation and say, yes, we too believe that. And then they talk themselves towards a form of evangelicalism. I think, casting back to the previous question about thesis topics, it's the theoretical paucity, I think, in a lot of evangelical historiography, which means that remains a problem for a lot of how we write about the rest of the world. In one of her wonderful throwaway lines, Edith once said, well, Pentecostalism, it's world evangelicalism. And then we went off chasing grants to go and look at globalisation and stuff for many years. But there was just a throwaway line which had emerged for her out of her study. I think it's that ability to get a hold of something which also has theoretical ramifications and leads to broader understandings, which helps the thesis topic, and also, on the other hand, stops us from despairing that evangelicalism will somehow disappear because the current coalitions or current forms of it are in decline. That may be the case, but I think it has a wonderful way of, in a sense, reorganising itself and then re-emerging and re-identifying itself with the forces which, in a sense, it will re-energise it generation after generation.
I would make one comment without entering this debate among my colleagues about whether there is evangelicalism. Certainly one thing that unites evangelicals in the modern world, I think, is they don't believe very much in institutions. And they follow charismatic leaders, and they're part of new movements. And they don't believe much investing in institutions. And it's that sort of localism, sort of dynamism, ability. I mean, it's in striking contrast to Roman Catholics, who have as many disagreements as within Protestantism, but there is the tent is made big and allow those disagreements. Evangelicals tend to split. They tend to follow the next new good idea, and so it's that sort of dynamism, but also it's deeply fragmented. And I certainly don't. The evangelicals aren't any closer to building anything like a university than they were in Carl Henry's time, because it's maybe with the exception of Baylor. But overall, it seems to me, whether here or abroad, it's a movement, but doesn't take many institutional forms.
I actually like to hear from Grant, who's spent a lot of years working on Mr. Evangelical, who has been inactive for several years, but I think Billy Graham, for many years, seemed to be a rallying point for evangelicals of different type, but then also for different varieties of other kinds of Christian people.
Mr. Graham presents the enigma of studying evangelicalism in a very crisp form, and that he's often regarded as the paradigmatic expression of evangelicals. And yet, what is fascinating and for some people troubling about his career is how much he embraced the rest of the culture and the rest of Protestantism and the rest of Catholicism in America. And one of the most common lines that Graham used was, I will go anywhere, I will speak to anybody, anytime, as long as they do not ask me to change what I'm saying. And that kind of openness enabled him to embrace a great deal of the culture and at the same time keep a kind of core commitment that enabled both himself and his, core contributors to think that he represented something that was stable. Yeah.
Given that evangelicalism as a movement is rooted in a very high view of biblical authority, and that biblical authority is how evangelicalism is a huge driving force. Given trends at the intellectual level of postmodern reconsiderations and really reconfigurations of biblical authority, I'm thinking of like post-conservative scholars who are rethinking biblical authority along lines of realizing that even the biblical writers, so they would say, are coming out of a particular culture, and therefore we have to negotiate that change in culture as we consider what influence they should have on us. And then at the grassroots level, you have all kinds of rise of biblical ignorance. Is there a sense in which evangelicalism in the future is poised for radical change simply because of its different attitudes towards the Bible?
This is another question toward the future, which historians are not very good at. The critical question is not evangelicalism or evangelicals, but Christianity. And there's no doubt in my mind that Christians are always going to have a central place for the Bible. How central? In what ways central? How expressed centrally? Central along with what other church and non-church traditions? These are the variables. I appreciate Mark Hutchinson's statement that in some parts of the world, the evangelicalism of the future is going to be recovered drug addicts. And I'm guessing that the passages in the book of Acts are going to remain very much alive, but maybe some elsewhere in the scriptures might not. Studying evangelicals and being historians means that you're going to be depressed half the time, but the other half of the time you realize that sinners saved by grace are going to be around till the end of time, and they'll be reading the Bible till the end of time.
Joel? Yes, many of you know I run an institute now that studies Christian movements outside of the North Atlantic quadrant, by and large. And one of my favorite aphoristic definitions of evangelical is the one that comes from Andrew Walls, where he says that historic evangelicalism is a movement of protest against a Christian society that isn't Christian enough. So, hearkening to its roots in Christendom, its attacks on complacent and nominal Christianity and on Christian establishments, some of the dynamics that Nat was just mentioning. What I want to say then is evangelicalism necessarily a Western thing predicated by Christendom. And does it really make sense as a category then even if you put David's quadrilateral out there, I'd say, well, in some respects, which Christians in India are not evangelicals? Does the category make sense outside of the West? I just this evening I was visiting a clerk in the library upstairs. I found out that Reverend Emmanuel, who said he might come tonight, I don't know if is he here. Yes, he's here. Reverend Emmanuel from Rwanda is the General Secretary of the Baptist Church of Rwanda, right? He's the kind of student here at Wheaton that got me going in this field in the first place. But is this live gospel movement in Rwanda, would you say it's evangelical? Does the category work elsewhere?
Well, that's for the future, to quote Professor Noll, and we're not very good at the future. But let me have a crack at it, because Australians can bluff their way through things. I think it's that mutual recognition thing. That is, there's a sense in which, as David it points out nicely in his Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, what evangelical meant to a member of a church party who were called the evangelicals, as opposed to a non-denominational movement, as opposed to a group of people who were being described externally by others as evangelicals. Well, who was in those boxes, in a sense, shifted depending upon the standpoint of the person who was using the term. And for me, it's that sort of Marty's commented back in 1992, if you remember, Joel, where he said, the story of evangelicalism is not the story about the trees in the forest, it's about the fungus which grows around the roots of the trees, And it's which left me thinking, well, there's sort of glass half full, glass half empty, I'm green, but I'm a fungus, so I had to go work that one through for a while, from the distance of Australia. So I think, at what point there is a sort of becoming evangelicalism, I think. That is when evangelicals, they decide to get together and there's a key issue, and then they sort of get out of their localities and they decide to pass legislation on children working in mines, for example, or against slavery or whatever. In a sense, they recognise others who otherwise they would not have spoken about, and then develop, because of their pragmatism, the list of things which, in a sense, they can agree upon, and then that breaks up, and then down the track they come across something else. Now, that's very much a type of evangelicalism which resonates very nicely with global Pentecostalism. That it's this meeting, this indigeneity, as David Martin talks about, and of people, in a sense, meeting one another and then finding in that meeting the language to talk about their experiences and their beliefs, which then becomes evangelical. Now, that's a sort of evangelicalism. Now, it's not very popular in the West because we have this sort of Enlightenment predisposition towards essentialism, where we go looking for the box, and we always want to define the box and therefore define the people against the box. But, when we talk about a high view of Scripture, well, Anglo-Catholics have a high view of Scripture. And lots of them found themselves becoming evangelicalised through the charismatic movement. They become much more biblicist, much more social activists, much more crucicentric. And through the later 1960s, as Larry has pointed out, that there was a sort of evangelicalisation of a lot of traditions as well. And the other thing is, in terms of at what time was this high view of Scripture, in a sense, conflated with the idea of inerrancy, etc., because you don't find Wesley talking about inerrancy. Back in 1743, he talks about dependability, and for him, even Locke thinks that the Bible is dependable. He's happy to draw upon it to talk about it as, in a sense, a basis for reasoning. So I think looking for essentialist categories like that, I think you come back to your locality, and you have to be able to define about what are we talking about, which evangelicals at what time, in what place, and would they recognise each other if you threw them into the Super Bowl together?
We have time for one more question.
My uncle, Muggeridge, was very much a media man, and you would have heard him on the BBC over the years, long since deceased now. But the BBC are now thinking of new media channels and developing a new religious channel which will use the social media, and Chris might like to comment on it because I'm sure he knows about it. My other question is, what's the difference between an evangelist and an evangelical?
Well, it depends on which language you work in. In Italy, there is no difference because there's no word for evangelical which does not also mean evangelist. And in Spanish, they have the same sort of problem. But apart from the linguistic games, I'll let David answer the...
On the second question, I don't know about the first. On the second, an evangelist preaches the gospel, an evangelical believes it. Sometimes they're the same people. Sorry.
Could you comment on the BBC as well? Have you?
I didn't quite get the drift of the social media bit towards the end. I'm
well,
sorry.
You were saying that the penetration was very low in the UK.
Yes.
And the BBC seemed to be addressing it. I just wondered whether you could comment on how important that would be.
Right. The BBC had a policy of being very wary of religious groups of an intense kind of any variety. Evangelicals were always defined as intense. There was a brief period, especially in Scotland, between 1952 and 1954, when there was significant penetration of a dimension of the BBC network within the United Kingdom. That could be a precedent for future penetration, contemporary penetration perhaps. I am not familiar with any evidence of that. I have quite strong sense of penetration by other groups of people within the BBC, not least in Scotland, and I don't get a stronger sense of the gospel being commended by the BBC now than it has been in the past. Malcolm Muggeridge was quite good at it, though, and that he was good at everything in terms of communication.
Yeah. Thank you. Grant Wacker.
We need a break.
Yeah.
I need a...
We have one more part of the program,
Yep.
and we are going to take a break. And so please stay with us. Thank you. Do you know, are we supposed to go down there? I think it's all right to stay here. Huh? Somebody is. I don't, but I'm not.
I presume Grant is. Oh, right.
I mean, we shouldn't.
It's actually a good debate. I don't
All right, folks. There's more to our program. A little more.
Backs.
Could we have your attention, please?
So at this point in the evening, I had talked with Edith about what the ISAE has meant to me personally, and I was going to frame that as a kind of intellectual and spiritual autobiography which is mediated through the ISAE. However, that was a ruse. I'm not going to do that. What we want to do at this point is talk about the person who has been the director of the ISAE for the last 15 years. And, of course, that is Edith Blumhofer. And several people in this room have worked with Edith at length. And we want to let them speak very briefly, and then I want to speak briefly at the end. Mark is one of the co-directors of the ISAE from years past, and he'll have a few reflections.
Well, I'm especially glad for this opportunity tonight to talk about Edith and the 15 years as director, but then several years of association before that. Another ISAE idea, its origin, meaning another idea from Nathan about how to organize historians, was that there'd be a good idea if there might be short, accessible biographies modeled on the wonderful Little Brown series on religious figures. He secured some money to get this series started, and the series has been outstanding, but not from Hatch or Noll or Carpenter or Hart, but from Edith. The series is now 20-plus volumes. Wheaton College authors, Lyle Dorset writing on Billy Sunday, Roger Lundeen writing on Emily Dickinson took part. A number of ISAE regulars took part. But Edith's two books, Amy Semple McPherson, Everybody's Sister, My Heart Can See the Life and Hymns of Fannie J. Crosby, were marked by thorough research, understated arguments, careful attention to popular figures, such as eggheads like maybe myself just couldn't get into, but who were almost demonstrably more important than the ones I could really get into. Edith provided clear biographical treatment of. So she was a director who led by directing, but also by showing the rest of us the way.
Thank you, Mark. Joel Carpenter worked with Edith in the ISAE. Joel, do you want to come up?
I think so.
Sure. I was director when Edith first came on, and she came on as a project director. And I quickly found out that not only was the project in good hands, but I had better get out of the way. Because Edith had more ideas before breakfast than I had in a month. And once she had an idea, she was going to run with it, and it was going to take a direct course. And so I found out very quickly that the formula to success was let her run with it, let it go, and we saw famous results. This was, I believe it was a conference and book on kind of international revivalism, was it not? Modern Christian revivals, yeah. And it was comparative. It was around the world. And it was a great delight for me to work with her here. And I thought so much of her that when I got to Pew and I needed a new program officer, a senior program officer at the Pew Charitable Trusts, I enticed Edith and Ed to move out to the Philadelphia area. And I think in many respects it was good for Edith. I'm not so sure it was good for Ed. And my deep regrets for that, but we made some very important things happen at Pew, and not the least of those was getting Marty's attention about Edith's talents as a project meister. So he recruited her away from us. So she and Ed had the delight and privilege to circle back to the Chicago area and to get busy here too. But I have always admired Edith's intelligence. Even her kids were smarter than I am, and she's been such a productive scholar. She's taken on such an amazing variety of topics. Some of us are kind of Johnny One-Notes, you know, but that's not Edith. And so what a perfect person to give the ISAE leadership and direction through a variety of featured, focused areas of endeavor over a decade and a half, and my hat's off to her.
Thank you, Joel. Daryl, are you here? Yes, all right. Great.
I had imagined giving these reflections and some sort of room over cocktails and cheese now that the ban on alcohol at Wheaton is gone, but that's not where we are. Maybe my written remarks are better, more appropriate for this setting. I plan to say more about this tomorrow morning, but for now, I'll confess that when I came to Wheaton in 1989 to direct the Institute, Edith intimidated me. I am sure that may have been partly a function of my complicated relationship with my mother, which likely framed my relations with all women. But whatever the explanation, my strategy from day one was to give Edith lots of room. Now, it's confirmed by Joel's remarks as well. As it turned out, as much as it may have been a smart strategy, it really wasn't a decision. Well before Edith came to the Institute, she was her own woman, and nothing I might do as director would change that. Heck, if Bill Hutchinson couldn't make her write a dissertation on one of his beloved Protestant modernists, I wasn't going to have Edith come to weekly meetings with a list of goals and a spreadsheet with steps to accomplishing them. And it should be said that maybe Bill figured she had already done Protestant modernist penance by writing a thesis at Hunter College on Harry Emerson Fosdick. As near as I can tell, when Edith ventured off to graduate school in the early 1970s, the obvious places to study American religious history were Yale, where Sidney Alstrom held court, Harvard with Bill Hutchinson, Chicago with Martin Marty, where he worked as dean of the field, Princeton with John Wilson, or Johns Hopkins with Timothy Smith. If you wanted to study Pentecostalism, Tim Smith at Hopkins may have been the most plausible choice given his familiarity with matters Wesleyan and holiness. But Edith went her own way and chose to study at Harvard with Bill Hutchinson, the premier historian of liberal Protestantism, and George Hudson Williams, a historian of remarkably eclectic interests and topics. There, in the relatively quiet days of HDS academic diversity, before the politics of sexual identity had swamped race, class, and gender, Edith finished a dissertation on the influence of the non-Wesleyan roots of Pentecostalism. Randall Stevens locates Edith in the Keswickian wing of Pentecostal historiography. These scholars, with Edith at the lead, stressed the finished work of conversion and did not believe in a second work of grace as the Wesleyans did. In other words, Restorationism and Dispensationalism rendered an account of spirit baptism that little resembled the Wesleyan view, because it empowered believers for service, but was not a sanctifying or perfecting experience. Already in graduate school, Edith was challenging received categories for understanding American Protestants. In 1987, when she came to the Institute, Edith added a distinct academic patch to an already colorful quilt. The co-founders, Mark Noll and Nathan Hatch, had both studied as undergraduates at Wheaton before going in different directions for graduate school, and I hope I get this right, guys. Mark to Vanderbilt to work with Wilhelm Pauck, and Nat to study with John Murren at Washington University. Joel Carpenter, the first director, had studied at Calvin with George Marsden before working with Tim Smith at Johns Hopkins. Among the advisors to the Institute were George Marsden himself, who had been a graduate student under Alstrom at Yale, Skip Stout, who had also studied as an undergraduate at Calvin when George was there, and finished his PhD with Bob Swearinga at Kent State, another historian from Calvin College. Grant Wacker, a Wesleyan of some strain of holiness who takes an illicit pleasure in cigars, countered the reformed hegemony of ISAE's brain trust with formal training at Harvard with Bill Hutchinson and professional encouragement from Tim Smith, who lived in Boston and preached at a Nazarene congregation while Grant was in grad school. I should also mention that Nat Hatch had worked with Tim Smith as a postdoctoral student at Hopkins. Even so, for all of Tim Smith's influence on the Institute's historians, Jim Bratt's presence as an advisor who had studied at Calvin before Yale was another indication of the Marsden-Alstrom influence at the Institute. Also among the advisors was the unpredictable Randy Ballmer, once described to me as the most handsome man in Christendom, who had studied at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School with John Woodridge before finishing a dissertation at Princeton with John Wilson. All things considered, the scholars who comprised the so-called evangelical historiographical mafiosi had ties to Don Marsdeniano, Don Smith-Feasy, or Don Hutchinsonini. These academic families only fought when another Don Dayton, became frustrated that the Wesleyan and Reform wings of evangelicalism didn't wage war for control of the evangelical Protestant narrative. Edith's presence at Wheaton could have conceivably tipped the balance of Reformed Wesleyan relations. She brought a Harvard PhD, a body of work on Pentecostalism, and experience teaching for Assemblies of God academic institutions to work with Joel, whose intellectual debt to Tim Smith was significant. Would the Institute shift from a narrative centered around Reformed leading fundamentalists and evangelicals to one that featured the important achievement of Wesleyan and holiness Protestants, as Don Dayton insisted? If you look at the conferences and books produced during those years that Joel and Edith worked together, the answer would have to be an emphatic no. The topics of the ISAE programs from that time were foreign missions, voluntary associations, public life, evangelicals and mass media, and revivalism. Only with a Lilly grant in 1991 did Edith generate a project on Pentecostalism, but as usual, she did it with a twist. Pentecostalism and mainstream Protestantism was the project's theme. While Edith carried out the program of the Institute, she continued her own contribution to the study of American Protestantism, neither by trying to write Wesleyan and holiness influence into the mainstream of evangelicalism, nor by becoming an advocate of the Edwards to Beecher to Ockengay narrative. Instead, she carved out her own academic interests and resisted the categories that dominated the study of Protestants outside the mainline denominations by showing the fluidity and diversity that characterized all Christians in the United States not in fellowship with the Bishop of Rome. Two examples make this point plausible. In her book on the Assemblies of God, Restoring the Faith, Edith paid close and careful attention to the development of Pentecostalism as both a distinct expression of Protestantism that also bore the fingerprints of hallmark evangelical notions. On the one hand, Pentecostals tapped roots among radical evangelicals of all denominations who pursued experiential holiness. People who came from the revivalistic New School backgrounds rather than from Wesleyan-rooted denominations. On the other hand, the Pentecostals who led in the formation of the Assemblies of God did so on the basis of a distinct understanding of holiness and the Holy Spirit that allowed an institutional identity separate from holiness-leaning or experience-craving Baptists, Christian and missionary alliancers, Presbyterians, or Congregationalists. Only in the 1940s did the assemblies enter the so-called evangelical mainstream by joining the National Association of Evangelicals. Even then, Pentecostal did so with a measure of trepidation. What is striking in Edith's account is her disinterest in claiming too much for her subjects. She didn't argue that somehow these Pentecostals were the ones who truly embodied evangelicalism, nor did she portray Pentecostalism as the true faith that genuine evangelicals needed to follow. Her conclusion that the numerical stagnation and decline of the assemblies is a problem affecting all Christians who strive to be faithful in the modern secular world avoids furthermore the triumphalism that often afflicts the history of evangelicalism when scholars try to justify their research to a wider audience. Instead of a lesson on what makes for a successful religion, Edith was willing to consider lessons about religious declension. And I'm almost finished, but her book on Amy Semple McPherson is another example of Edith's historiographical modesty, even if her subject this time, the incomparable showwoman, Sister Amy, registered high marks on all the important measures of success and fame. In fact, Edith argued that the figure of Sister Amy offered the opportunity to re-examine the way that historians had distinguished among mainline Protestants, evangelicals, and Pentecostals. What Amy's life revealed was a much more complicated picture of Protestant devotion that crossed denominational and conservative versus liberal lines. On the one hand, Sister envisioned Pentecostalism as preeminently a personal experience, best described in the vague but powerful cultural memory of old-time Methodist camp meetings. She adds, traditional Protestants of many denominations welcomed Sister everywhere and professed that their faith was awakened in her services. In other words, Amy transcended denominational categories and demonstrated the remarkable fluidity of American Protestantism. Edith's biography of Sister confirmed the earlier point that she had made about the Assemblies of God, though she hardly drew attention to herself in that confirmation. Her book on Amy also pointed the way toward another significant subject, both for Edith and the Institute. One, namely, on hymnody. Christian song was one feature of Sister's ministry that reached beyond conventional boundaries to establish new ways of defining who stood on the inside and outside, and even suggested an approach to the study of American Christianity more revealing of boundaries than theology or institutional structures. This point foreshadowed Edith's biography of Fanny Crosby, a hymn writer with New England Calvinist roots, whose powerful songs manifested a sort of primal 19th century evangelicalism that prior to the conflicts of the 20th century was fluid, imprecise, evocative, inchoate rather than rigid. Edith's insights about Sister Amy were no doubt also responsible for the words by which she and Mark Noll introduced the book that came from the Institute's 2000 conference on hymnody. Hymns have created and sustained community, expressed fundamental human aspirations, invigorated religious convictions with moving emotional force, promoted religious fellowship among disparate peoples, allowed otherwise inarticulate people to voice their most ardent longings, comforted the grieving, nerved vast numbers for religious and social service. Edith has made her scholarly contribution about Pentecostalism, evangelicalism, women, and hymnody in quiet ways. Perhaps she needed more the flamboyance of Sister Amy to draw more attention to her important scholarship, and perhaps the Institute needed a Sister Amy to keep it going. But Edith's quiet and modest manner was exactly what a novice administrator looking to keep the good ship ISAE on track and schedule needed.
Thank you, Daryl. I had asked Mark and Joel to say a few words about working with Edith in the ISAE, and Daryl has offered a very thoughtful analysis of Edith's work more academically. I want to conclude with a more personal reminiscence. My own history with Edith goes way, way back to the mid-1970s when we were both graduate students at Harvard. And I actually have known Edith longer than my wife. When we were in the beginning of our graduate program, I remember our mentor, Bill Hutchinson, came to me one day and he said, I was in the master's program and he was speaking for the PhD program, and he said, we have just admitted a new star to our PhD program. And of course, that was Edith, and it was the beginning of a 4-decade friendship, which I regard as one of the great unforeseen privileges of my life, both academically and personally. I want to speak very briefly about Edith's multiple forms of achievement, and I'm not going to go into close analysis, but just to say a word about the range of publications, I think, would give us a sense of all the many things she has worked on. As Daryl indicated in her dissertation, she pioneered a critical, empathetic study of early Pentecostal theology, and no one or hardly anyone had done that before her time. And her first book, which was about the Assemblies of God, she pioneered the art of writing denominational history as broader cultural history. In a small volume about the Assemblies of God, she pioneered the art of turning cultural history into popular history for the edification of believers. In her study of Amy Semple McPherson, I think she pioneered the art of applying the notion of critical empathy to a highly charismatic figure in our history. In her biography of Fanny Crosby, she pioneered the weaving of music and biography and popular history and popular emotion or sentiment. What you'll notice here, I keep using the word pioneer. She pioneered all these many ways of thinking. Now she just finished another book on the history of world Christianity, and fits into another pioneering mode of bringing this great synoptic vision into one volume. Now, I want to say just a few words, and I'll make it only a few words, about what I think makes Edith's work distinctive in terms of method. First is the clarity. Clarity is a trait of how her mind works in every respect, but what I find especially appealing and wonderful about her work is how she has avoided the perils of obfuscation and jargon, and instead has just been determined to make her work accessible to a larger audience. The second way is the art of critical empathy. And this is especially important in the study of Pentecostals and evangelicals, because so often these fields have been studied with a great measure of condescension by academic historians, especially before the people who work with the ISAE. And Edith has shown how it's possible to study these traditions critically, but also from the inside with the heart of an insider, showing how it's possible to understand the traditions without necessarily embracing all of their claims. Third feature, which I wish to stress, and that is Edith's treatment of the role of women in American religious history. All of her writing reveals an acute sensitivity to the places that women have, and perhaps more importantly, have not occupied in the historiography of American religion. And I find that she brings our attention around to this subject in the professional meetings and in numerous conversations. And I think that may be Edith's most important contribution among the many others to our field. Work about her institutional achievement at the ISAE. The Victorians would have said that someone shouldered a task manfully. Well, Edith has shouldered this task womanfully of writing grant proposals and winning grants and orchestrating countless conferences and carrying the conferences through to publication. And she also has dealt with the politics of Wheaton College. It's hard to imagine there would be politics here, but she's dealt with the politics of Wheaton College and of the Lilly Endowment and the Pew Charitable Trust and Oxford University Press, and she has done this adeptly, and that's an admirable achievement in itself. Finally, I want to talk about Edith personally, and I think that the main word I would use here is kindness. Unflagging kindness, which shows up in all of her work. She takes her work seriously, but not herself. And we find that in countless small favors and small kindnesses. When my daughters were born, we found baby blankets in the mail that she had knitted. And when I come here to work in the archives, I am treated with German coffee cake and strong black coffee, which she goes out to buy the special beans that she knows I like. But more important, always the encouraging word. Always the encouraging word, and that is almost impossible to exaggerate how important that has been. I close with this comment. Amy Semple McPherson once said, "I only remember the days when the sun shines." Well, I would say that for all of us who worked in the ISAE, being around Edith and working with Edith, we have found that her contribution has made the sun shine very much brighter in our lives. And for that, we are profoundly grateful and indebted, and we do love you. And thank you, Edith.
Thank you all. I have no idea how to respond quickly and fully, but I would say that everything that I accomplished in my years, many years at the ISAE from 1987 to 95 and then 99 and on, I did in the company of all these wonderful people. What I know about grant writing, I learned from Joel, and on and on. My friendships with all of the people who've spoken and the others from the ISAE have shaped the scholar and person that I became for whatever good or evil, I guess I should say. It is my duty to make the final announcements tonight, and there are a couple of them that are important for you to hear. So we are eager to get responses from you. If you have reflections or thoughts about the ISAE, you'll find out on the table a sheet that looks like this. And a pen, I think, is there too, and a box. So if you would like to give any thoughts or thanks or reflect on your involvement, this would be a way to do it. On the sheet, there's also an email address, so that if you're not up to thinking about this tonight and completing it, you can take the address and email it to us. And we were trying to think about how we could give people input. We've gotten some emails and some letters, and we just wanted to invite people more generally. If there's anything you want to say, don't feel under any obligation. And then our most recent ISAE-related product has been mentioned already tonight. It is America's Pastor, Billy Graham, and the Shaping of a Nation, which I think has an official release date sometime next week. But here it is. And Grant Wacker is here as well, and he is willing to sign the copies that, if there are any of them still available out there, may be available at the book table. Also at the book table, you will find a selection of books by other ISAE-related scholars, many of whom are here, and so you might get them autographed too. So thank you so much for your attention and for your support of the ISAE over these years. And so I now invite you to join us in one more of our ISAE traditions, which is a reception out in the foyer in the lobby of the Graham Center here. So there'd be no more appropriate way to end, I don't think, one of our public meetings in Barrows Auditorium. So please move that way, and I hope that the good conversation that created such a good hum at the beginning of this will continue out in the hall. Thank you.